The day my grandmother was buried, my stepfather looked me in the eye and told me I had no place at the reading of her will. Not quietly. Not with any shred of decency. He said it in the hallway of the funeral home, right outside the room where her casket was still surrounded by white lilies, while my half-brother stood behind him with his hands in his pockets and said nothing. "This doesn't concern you," my stepfather said. His name was Gene, and he had been in my mother's life since I was 9 years old. He'd never legally adopted me, never tried, but he'd spent 26 years making sure I understood exactly where I stood in that household. Just far enough inside the door to be useful, never far enough in to matter. I was 31 years old, standing in a hallway that smelled like carnations and carpet cleaner, wearing the only black dress I owned. And the man who had eaten at my grandmother's table every Thanksgiving for 2 decades was telling me her death wasn't my business. My grandmother, Grammy Voss, everyone called her, though her real name was Helen, had raised me for 3 years when my mother was going through her second divorce. I was 6, 7, 8 years old, sleeping in the back bedroom of her house in Columbus, Ohio, doing my homework at her kitchen table, learning to make biscuits from scratch on Sunday mornings because she said a woman should know how to feed herself. She was the steadiest person in my childhood, the only one who never moved the goalposts. And now she was gone, and Jean was telling me the reading of her will was a family matter. "I am family," I said. He looked at me the way he always had, like I was a smudge on something clean. "You're not in the will, Marisol. There's nothing for you to hear." My half-brother, Ty, finally looked up. He's Jean's son from his first marriage, 4 years younger than me, never worked a job longer than 8 months in his life. He gave me a small, almost apologetic shrug, then followed his father into the conference room and closed the door. I stood in that hallway for a long moment. Then I walked to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and cried until I couldn't breathe. Not because of the money. I hadn't even let myself think about money. I cried because she was gone and they had already turned her into a transaction, and I hadn't even gotten to say goodbye properly because Jean had managed the hospital visits in her final 2 weeks and somehow my calls kept going unreturned. I drove home on autopilot. My apartment was a 40-minute drive from the funeral home, a one-bedroom in Westerville that I'd been renting since I left my mother's house at 22. I was a paralegal at a mid-sized firm downtown. I paid my own bills. I had a savings account with enough in it that I didn't panic at unexpected expenses. I had built a life that was entirely my own, with no help from Jean or my mother or anyone, and I was proud of that. I had to be. There was no one else to be proud of me. I made tea. I didn't drink and sat at my kitchen table until it got dark. Then my phone rang. It was my aunt, my mother's younger sister, Vera. She'd been at the funeral, but we'd only managed a quick hug before the service started. Vera had always been the quieter one, the one who stayed out of things, the one who showed up but never intervened. She lived in Pittsburgh now, had for years. "Are you home?" she asked. "Yes, I'm outside." I looked at my phone. She'd driven 3 hours from Pittsburgh without telling me. I went to the door and there she was, standing on my front step in her funeral clothes, holding a manila envelope against her chest like she was afraid someone might take it from her. She came inside and sat at my kitchen table, the same place I'd been sitting alone 20 minutes earlier, and for a long time she just looked at the envelope in her hands. "Farah?" I said. "What is that?" She looked up at me, and her eyes were red. "Grammy gave this to me 2 months ago," she said. "She made me promise not to give it to you until after the reading today. She was very specific about that. She said you needed to hear what Jean had to say first." I didn't understand that then. I would later. Vera slid the envelope across the table to me. Inside was a letter in my grandmother's handwriting, slanted and careful, the way she always wrote, like every word was deliberate, and behind it a series of documents I didn't immediately understand. A deed. A trust document. Something from an attorney's office in Columbus with a date from 8 months ago. I read the letter first. My grandmother wrote that she had known, for most of my life, something I did not know. She wrote that she had kept it from me because my mother had begged her to, and because she had believed, for a long time, that it wasn't her secret to tell. But in her last year, watching what Jean had done to our family, watching what my mother had allowed, she'd decided that silence was just another way of choosing a side. and she was done being silent. My father, the man I had always been told was my father, a man named Ray who'd left before I turned 4 and whom I had exactly 2 memories of, was not my biological father. My biological father was my grandmother's brother, a man named Thomas Foss who had died in a car accident in 1997 when I was 3 years old. I had to read that paragraph 3 times. Thomas Foss had never married. He had no other children. And 8 months before she died, my grandmother had worked with an estate attorney to establish a trust in my name, funded by the sale of a piece of commercial property in Delaware County that Thomas had owned and that had, over the decades, appreciated into something significant. The trust was separate from her personal estate entirely. Jean had known nothing about it. The will reading today, the one I'd been excluded from, had distributed her personal assets, which were modest. The house, some savings, her car. That was Ty's inheritance, and my mother's, and a small bequest to her church. The trust was mine, just mine, and it had already been executed. I looked up at Vera. She was watching me with her hands folded on the table like she was waiting for a verdict. "This is real," I said. It wasn't a question exactly. "It's real," she said. "The attorney's name is at the bottom of the letter. She said you could call first thing tomorrow. She's expecting you." "Thomas Foss," I said. "My father." Vera nodded slowly. "He was a good man. You have his eyes." "I always thought so, but I never—" She stopped. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't help." I didn't know what to feel. There was grief in it, grieving a man I never knew I'd lost, grieving the version of my history I'd always believed. There was anger at my mother for the lie and a complicated tenderness for my grandmother for trying, even at the end, to make it right. Mostly I sat there in the quiet of my kitchen and thought about how a woman in her final months, knowing she was running out of time, had spent her energy not on herself, but on making sure I was protected, that she had gone to an attorney, filed the paperwork, created a structure that Jean couldn't touch, and handed it to Vera with instructions, like a relay baton, so that it would reach me exactly when I needed it. She had planned this like a general. I called the attorney the next morning. Her name was Miss Ellery, and she was precise and kind and did not waste my time. The trust held the proceeds from the commercial property sale, a distribution center building that Thomas had bought in the late 80s that had been leased to a logistics company for 30 years. When it sold the previous winter, the proceeds after taxes came to just over $400,000. The trust named me as sole beneficiary. Miss Ellery had already filed everything with the probate court. There was no mechanism by which Jean or my mother or anyone else could contest it, because the trust had been established and funded before my grandmother's death and was entirely separate from her estate. I sat in my car in the parking garage after that call and stared at the concrete wall in front of me for a long time. Then I called Vera. "Does my mother know?" I asked. There was a pause. Grammy told her. "A few weeks before she passed. She said your mother cried but didn't argue." I thought about calling my mother then. I picked up my phone and put it down 3 times. We had a relationship that I can only describe as careful. We spoke on holidays, remembered each other's birthdays, kept the water calm by never going very deep. I loved her in the way you love someone who disappointed you so thoroughly and so early that you stopped expecting things from them and just started maintaining. It's a quiet kind of love. Not warm, just present. I didn't call her. I didn't call Jean either, obviously, but Jean called me. 4 days after the funeral, on a Wednesday evening, my phone rang and his name appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message asking me to call him back when I had a minute, in the cheerful tone he used when he wanted something. I did not call back. He tried twice more over the next week. On the 3rd call, he left a longer message, something about Grammy's personal items, some jewelry he thought I might want, a way to stay connected as a family. I stood in my kitchen listening to it and understood immediately what was happening. Somehow, through some channel, maybe my mother, maybe someone at the attorney's office who shouldn't have said anything, he had caught wind that there was more to Grammy's estate than he'd seen at the reading. I forwarded the voicemail to Ms. Neidl, Ellery, with a note asking if there was anything I needed to be aware of. She confirmed that the trust was ironclad, that there was no legal avenue through which Jean could make any claim, and that I was under no obligation to respond to him at all. I didn't. What I did instead was give myself 6 weeks to do nothing. I went to work, I came home, I cooked dinner and watched television and went to sleep. On weekends, I drove out to the cemetery and sat near Grammy's grave and talked to her, which felt absurd and necessary in equal measure. I told her about the phone calls. I told her I was angry at my mother and didn't know what to do with it. I told her that I'd been thinking about Thomas, her brother, my father, and that I wished I'd had the chance to know him, and that I understood now why she had always looked at me a certain way, with that particular mix of love and something that might have been guilt. I think she was trying to make up for what she'd stayed quiet about for 30 years. I don't know that I'll ever fully unknot how I feel about that. But I know she loved me. That was never in question. In the 7th week, I made 3 decisions. The first was to use a portion of the trust to pay off my remaining student loans and put a down payment on a condo. I had been renting for 9 years. I found a 2-bedroom in a neighborhood I loved, put in an offer, and it was accepted on a Thursday morning while I was at my desk eating a granola bar. I cried a little. Quietly, at my desk. My coworker across the partition handed me a tissue without asking questions, which is the ideal response. The second decision was to call my mother. I drove to her house. She and Jean lived in a colonial in Upper Arlington, 40 minutes from me, on a Saturday afternoon in October when the leaves were turning. Jean's truck was gone. I hadn't called ahead. I rang the doorbell and my mother answered in jeans and a cardigan and her reading glasses still on, and when she saw me, her face did something complicated that I couldn't fully read. She let me in. We sat at her kitchen table, the same way Vera and I had sat at mine, and I told her that I knew. About Thomas. About all of it. She was quiet for a long time. I was going to tell you, she said finally. When you were older. Then older kept moving. I know, I said. I'm sorry. I had imagined this conversation 100 times in the previous weeks, and in most of those versions I had things to say. Real things, hard things. The kind of sentences that had been building in me since I was a child and didn't have the words for them yet, but sitting across from her in that kitchen, looking at how much she had aged in the past year, I found that what I actually felt was tired. Tired of carrying the old anger. Tired of letting the gap between us stay exactly the shape it had always been, without anyone ever trying to change it. I don't want to pretend everything is fine, I said. It's not fine. There's a lot I haven't processed yet, but I don't want to lose whatever we actually have just because I'm angry. She nodded. Her eyes were wet. I want to know about him, I said. Thomas, whatever you can tell me. So she talked. For 2 hours, while the afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor, my mother told me about Thomas Boss, how she had met him through Grammy, how he had been gentle and funny, how things between them had been brief and complicated, how she had married Ray because Ray had asked and Thomas hadn't, and how she had convinced herself for years that it was kinder to say nothing. I didn't say she was right to make that choice. I didn't say she was wrong either. I just listened, because listening was something I could give her that didn't cost me the truth. When I got back to my car, I sat for a moment before turning the key. The trees on their street were orange and red against a gray sky. I thought about Grammy in her kitchen in Columbus, teaching me to make biscuits, watching me with that look I now understood differently. Some people protect you the only way they know how, which isn't always the right way. Some people wait until the very end to do the right thing. And some people, the rare ones, the ones you're lucky to have, even briefly, plan ahead, quietly and without fanfare to make sure you land on your feet even after they're gone. The third decision I'd made in that 7th week was about Jean. I didn't want revenge. That's the thing about real life. It rarely comes with clean villain moments. Jean was a small, insecure man who had used my presence in his family as a way to make himself feel larger. He wasn't dramatic enough to deserve a confrontation. What he deserved was irrelevance, and so that's exactly what I gave him. I stopped answering his calls. I had my number changed. When the holidays came, I sent my mother a card at her work address and suggested we have lunch sometime, just the 2 of us. She texted back a heart emoji and a date in January. We've been meeting for lunch every 6 weeks or so since then. We talk about careful things. Slowly, carefully, we are learning to go a little deeper each time. T reached out to me once a few months later. A text message, brief and awkward. Hey. I heard some stuff. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry I didn't say anything that day at the funeral home. I thought about what to write back for 2 days. Finally, I wrote, "Thank you. That means something." That was all. It wasn't reconciliation. It was just a door left slightly open in case either of us ever wanted to walk through it. The condo closed in December. I moved in on a weekend with a rented truck and 2 friends from work helping me carry boxes up the stairs. It was cold and the elevator was broken, and we ordered pizza and sat on the floor because I didn't have furniture yet, and it was one of the best days I'd had in years. Grammy would have liked it. She would have walked through every room with her hands clasped behind her back, the way she did when she was assessing something. And then she would have nodded and said something practical like, "Good closet space, or you'll need better curtains." She would not have said she was proud of me because that wasn't her style. She would have just shown up and helped me hang pictures and made sure I had dish soap under the sink. I have a framed photograph of her on my bookshelf now. It's from 1994, before I was born, and she's standing in front of a lake somewhere with a big fish on a line and the most satisfied expression I've ever seen on a person's face. I don't know where the lake was. I don't know who took the picture, but she looks so completely herself in it that every time I walk past it, I have to stop for a second. I didn't get justice in a courtroom. There was no hearing, no gavel, no moment where Gene had to publicly account for what he'd done. Real life doesn't usually deliver that. What I got instead was a woman who loved me quietly and fiercely for 31 years and spent her last months making sure I knew it in a language that couldn't be contested or taken away. I got a name, Thomas Voss, and history I'm still learning, and a father I'll never meet but who left something behind for me anyway, passed through hands that cared, arriving exactly when I needed it to. Some days that feels like enough. Some days it feels like enough. Some days it feels like more than enough. On the hard days, I go make biscuits from scratch because she taught me how, and I stand in my own kitchen, in my own home, and I remember that the steadiest person in my life believed I was worth protecting. That's the thing she gave me that can't be put in a trust document or signed by an attorney. I'm still figuring out everything else. But I know how to land on my feet. She made sure of that. I keep thinking about the fish photo on my bookshelf. Grammy standing at the edge of some lake I'll never find, holding that line like she'd earned it, looking more certain of herself than anyone I've ever known in person. She didn't need anyone to validate that moment. She just caught the fish, stood in the sun, and let someone take the picture. That's what I was still learning to do when all of this happened. Stand in my own moment without waiting for someone to tell me it counted. Gene didn't take anything from me the day he closed that conference room door. He thought he did. That's the thing about people who operate from smallness. They genuinely believe that excluding you is the same as diminishing you. But you can't take from someone what they've already built inside themselves. He just didn't know I had anything built. I'm not sure I fully knew it either until I was forced to find out. What I've come to understand, sitting with all of it these past months, is that actions don't exist in a vacuum. Gene spent years making choices, small ones, daily ones, about who deserved to be seen and who didn't. And those choices compounded. They built a version of himself that, in the end, couldn't hold the room. My grandmother saw it. That's why she spent her final months not resting, not making peace with what was, but quietly, methodically correcting it. She understood something I'm only beginning to grasp. That integrity isn't what you perform in public. It's the decision you make at 10 p.m. when no one's watching, to call an attorney and do the right thing even though it costs you something. That took intelligence. Real intelligence, not just cleverness. She didn't react. She planned. She thought about consequences, about timing, about what I would need and when I would need it and who I would need it and who I would need to hear it from. She thought further ahead than most people think about anything, and she was right about all of it. The envelope arrived exactly when it needed to. Vera showed up exactly when I was sitting alone in my kitchen, not knowing what came next. And then there was what it cost me to stay up right through it. To not call Jean back and say every true thing I'd been holding for 20 years. To sit across from my mother in that kitchen and choose listening over winning. To take the grief and the anger and the shock of learning my own name differently and keep going to work on Monday anyway. Keep paying my bills, keep building the life I'd been building before any of this happened. That's not dramatic strength. It's just the daily kind. The kind that doesn't look like anything from the outside but is the only kind that actually sustains you. I think about Ty sometimes. That text he sent. I'm sorry I didn't say anything. It wasn't much. But it was more than nothing, and it was more than Jean ever gave me. I left the door open because I believe people can choose differently than they have before. Not easily, not without cost. But it's possible. I've seen it in my mother. Slowly, over lunch every 6 weeks, going a little deeper each time. Grammy left me money, but she also left me something she couldn't put in a trust document. The proof that someone who loved me had used every bit of her remaining time to think clearly, act honestly, and refuse to let the wrong thing stand just because it was easier. I'm trying to live up to that. Some days I come closer than others. The fish in that photo had no idea what was coming. Neither did I. But Grammy had her line in the water and she knew exactly what she was doing.